Fala pessoal, tudo bem? Eu sou o Pedro, eu tô aqui com o Curtiu. Ele vai responder uma perguntinha pra gente aqui, exclusivo para quem tá nos assistindo. A gente tem 10 minutinhos aqui em painéis. O Yarvin, para quem não sabe, é um dos filósofos mais influentes da nova direita americana. So, Kurt, thank you for joining us.
Muito prazer.
It's a pleasure having you. Let's go for the question because we don't have much time.
All right.
2 years ago, you wrote an article called 8 Terms for the Cultural War, where you present the idea that the right should orient itself for the future, right? Like thinking acorns versus trying to orient yourself for the hopes that have been planned for the past. And that sometimes it's better and more important to be aesthetically pleasing and relevant than to actually hold the right values just by holding them.
Well, you know, those things go together. I mean, art and values can't be separated. And, you know, what I see you doing here in a way is creating a new elite for Brazil, because the reality is that you have an existing elite that is very much a product of imitating the United States.
Yes.
And imitating, you know, very, very specific, imitating American elites, essentially.
If you guys have a cathedral, we have a humble church that's kind of crooked to the side.
Exactly. And you know, the realization that, you know, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, it was very easy in a country like Brazil to say, oh, well, what is Harvard doing? We'll just follow that. And, you know, in a world where people in America are starting to wake up and say, hey, maybe Harvard isn't doing the right thing. And there's sort of two aspects of questioning these powers. There's a populist aspect where the sort of the ordinary person, the Bolsonaro voter, will go out and say, hey, you know, these elites are crazy. They tell us that men can become a woman and women can become men. This is complete insanity. And they're not really wrong per se, but they don't have a solution. And when you have a problem, actually the most important thing is the solution. And I think the most important thing is, you know, what you have in a place like this is you have a bunch of young people realizing that there's a different way to be cool than basically following what just comes down mechanically from America. And I think actually, you know, this may seem like flattery, but it's something that I've said a bunch to Americans, is that, you know, there's a couple of different, there's another very different but also kind of new right movement here, Em Busca da Verdade, you know, which is also trying to invent a completely different way of being an elite, and sort of a much more old-fashioned way. You know, and I think the old-fashioned way has a lot to contribute. I also think that you can't go immediately directly back to the past and make Brazil a Catholic country run by Jesuits. You know, exactly. But that is your heritage, and you have a lot to learn from that. But that's not the future. But the idea that the future is sort of wide open and can be created here, and that actually you can do your own thing. And, you know, I'm down here with my friend Wolf Tivey from Palladium magazine, also very much inspired by these kinds of ideas. And frankly, we come here and we're like, oh yeah, we got to do this, right? You know, America needs this, right? You know, and so I'm not at all adverse to the idea that it should be America actually that's copying Brazilian ideas.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever seen that meme that goes like, that ending, the whole world is now Brazil.
Well, you know, it could be a good ending. I don't know.
Exactly.
It could be a good ending. You've had longer to deal with being Brazil.
Yes.
Brazil has been Brazil for quite some time.
The constraints of being Brazil have forced us to adapt. You know?
Yes. And in some of those ways, it's like, you know, like for a concrete example, last time I was in Sao Paulo, you know, I really experienced the existence of upper class life in Sao Paulo, which is that you're traveling between these security bubbles. You know,
Yes.
you go to the club, you go to the, and you live that way, you grow up that way, and it seems completely normal. In fact, it's completely insane.
Which brings me to another article of you, like Patchwork, right?
Yeah.
Where you claim that a better political organization would be competing bubbles state-wise.
Yes, but I think that actually, I stress that less than I used to in some ways, because I think that it's a sort of a beautiful answer for a result, but it doesn't really offer you ways of getting there. You can't really say, oh, our solution to Brazil is to like break up Brazil. It doesn't have the energy of, I mean, I think a long time ago, Rio and Sao Paulo almost fought a war, but
we had a couple of secession wars.
Yeah. But that the energy for that doesn't really exist in this world. But the energy to say, hey, we don't have to live with crime and gangs everywhere does exist. And, it's very inspiring. I've been also to El Salvador, and El Salvador is a much smaller country, but it's also a country whose Brazilian problems, you might say, were much worse than Brazil's.
Yes.
Right. And, I had a funny experience last time I was in San Salvador, which is that I brought my laptop to a conference, and then I realized that I had to walk across the city center carrying my laptop. And I did it.
Yeah.
And it was fine, right?
Yeah.
I knew it was going to be fine. And, it's actually like the crazy thing about El Salvador adopting the mano dura policies is that, first of all, they did everything Bukele just said, okay, I'm not going to listen to the State Department.
Yeah.
I'm not going to listen to the U.S. Embassy. I'm going to just shut my ears and do what I think is right. And, everyone expected them to fail at that. So, for example, mano dura policies have been tried. The State Department would tell you, oh, you tried that, and we tried mano dura twice in Honduras. Didn't work. Right? It never works. You have to go with what Harvard tells you. And Bukele's like, I think I can make it work. It turns out that the Dora just wasn't Dora enough.
And your theory, like, why does the cathedral always side with crime?
What? Because it creates power, and like you can see that power that's created by, when you're defending crime, you're defending, when the state protects crime. The state is inflicting a form of tyranny. It's what we call anarcho-tyranny on the population. And that gets you basically back to the question of why tyranny exists and why governments abuse their populations. And they abuse their populations because it generates this feeling of power. When you're a liberal and you defend criminals, it's almost like you enjoy a part of the crime.
How so?
Because the feeling, most crime is done for fun. It's, have you ever robbed someone? I've never robbed someone. Think about how fun that would be, right?
Yeah.
And when you're a pro-criminal sort of power, you experience that joy, you experience that pleasure. And even if it happens to you, you don't mind it as much because you identify with the criminal. It's a sort of Marxist identification. And then, of course, when you have that ideology and you're put in a situation where a gang is trying to bribe you with millions of dollars, it's sort of the same thing. Like if you look at Sheinbaum in Mexico, right? She's in bed with the cartels. Everyone knows she's in bed with the cartels. And that goes along with her, like, ideology in a way that's, like, really deeply corrupt. Contrarily, if you crack down on crime, you're actually cracking down on liberals in a way because you're taking so much of their energy away. Like the energy that they get from defending these people is enormous. By defending the indefensible, they exert power. And it's like power, when you become a journalist or even a professor in many fields in this world that we live in, that's a power profession. You're doing it to become powerful. And so to say, I have the power to inflict this terror, this scourge, this tyranny on you, it makes you feel important. It makes you feel big.
Let's see if I'm understanding. You're saying that by defending something that goes so much against the norm, they exert that power. And the fact that they can get away with it, it creates a feedback loop where they experience the power again.
Actually, literally, when human beings become more powerful, their testicles actually grow. And I think that you would see, if you measured the weight of journalists' testicles, you would see that they increase. That the testosterone increases, right?
But then there are some data that points that the more testosterone you have, the more right-wing you become.
Well, everything in life is a cycle, and that's why I think it's
horseshoe theory.
I think that's why it's important to target elites, because I think that the energy of elites realizing that this system doesn't work and basically coming back. These people still have a conscience. They still have values, right? And you know, when you respond to elites with hostility, when you attack them, when you try to rebel against them, they feel like the peasants are coming to kill them with pitchforks, right? Yeah. The elites of Brazil looked at Bolsonaro and they're like, Bolsonaro is coming to kill pitchforks and make our children be Pentecostalists and all of that. Yeah. You know, when you come to them with sympathy and you say, look, you're not bad people, you're just in a bad system. I understand why you're thinking this way, but really it's not the right way to think. Actually, you often find that you're pushing on an open door.
But wouldn't that imply on demanding that the people be the betterment in this conflict?
I think the people need to realize that the masses really can't govern by themselves. They need elites, and they need elites that they can trust, that really have their interests at heart. And they've been betrayed so many times. They're like a woman whose last 6 husbands have left her. They're like, all right, this one might be better, but you know, there's this old Russian proverb that applies to a lot of these right-wing efforts where, it's this classic Russian line. It's like, we hope things would be different, but it worked out as usual. and like preventing this from, clearly people here hope things will be different. So let's make sure they don't work out as usual.
It was a pleasure having you.
Absolutely.